The year was 1878, and the Texas wind was a thief. It stole the moisture from the soil, the hope from a man's heart, and scattered dust over every surface until the whole world seemed a uniform shade of despair. For Elias Vance, the wind was just another creditor he could not pay. His ranch, a sprawling tract of parched earth and brittle grass, was more a monument to failure than a home. It was the dream he and his wife, Martha, had poured their youth into, and now, with her 3 years gone, it was just a husk, much like himself. Elias was a man carved from the land's own hardship. His shoulders were stooped from labor that yielded little, his hands calloused and cracked from mending fences that enclosed nothing of value. The silence in his small clapboard house was a physical presence, a weight that pressed down on him in the quiet hours after the sun had bled out across the horizon. Grief was a patient companion. It sat with him at his solitary meals and lay beside him in the cold bed they had once shared. He spoke more to Martha's memory than he did to any living soul, his words swallowed by the vast, indifferent emptiness of the plains. His days fell into a rhythm of grim necessity. He would rise before dawn, the chill in the air a familiar bite, and force down a breakfast of stale bread and black coffee. He'd check on his meager herd of cattle, their ribs a stark testament to the unforgiving drought, and spend the rest of the day on tasks that felt like trying to dam a river with his bare hands. He hauled water from the nearly dry creek, patched the roof of his barn with sun-warped planks, and pulled relentlessly at the stubborn weeds that were the only things thriving on his land. It was a life of resignation, a slow, grinding surrender to the inevitable. One afternoon, as the sun hung in the sky like a merciless brass coin, a flicker of movement on the edge of his property drew his eye. It was not the familiar shape of a coyote or the slow drift of a vulture. It was people, a man, a woman, and a small child, moving with a steady, unhurried grace that seemed to belong to the land itself. They were Comanche. Elias watched from the cool shadow of his porch, his hand resting near the worn grip of the pistol on his hip, a precaution born of instinct and the harsh tales that drifted through the territory. But there was no threat in their posture. The man, Chayton, carried only a bow and a quiver of arrows. The woman, Winona, walked with their young son held close, her expression serene as she scanned the horizon. They were merely crossing the corner of his vast, empty property, a shortcut between the rolling hills and the distant line of the river. Elias felt the tension in his shoulders ease slightly. He had no quarrel with them. The land was big enough. He turned to go back inside, content to leave them be. That was when he heard the other sound, the ugly, aggressive thunder of shod hooves beating against the hard-baked earth, accompanied by the cruel laughter of men who found pleasure in the fear of others. A band of 5 riders crested the nearby rise, their figures silhouetted against the blinding sun. They were not ranchers. They were scavengers, their faces hard with malice and their clothes coated in the filth of the trail. Elias recognized their leader instantly, a man named Shaw, whose reputation for casual brutality was as wide as the Texas sky. Shaw and his men spurred their horses, circling the small family like wolves cornering a deer. Their intent was plain and vile. Elias's heart hammered against his ribs. This was not his fight. He was one man, old and tired. Intervening was a fool's errand, a death sentence. He could slip back into his house, bar the door, and pretend the wind had carried the sounds away. No one would blame him. No one would even know. But as he watched Shaw dismount and swagger toward Chayton, a sneer twisting his lips, something inside Elias broke. It was the image of the woman, Winona, pulling her child behind her, her body a shield against the coming storm. It was the quiet dignity of her husband, who stood his ground, his hand gripping a small knife, ready to die for them. In that moment, Elias saw not a stranger, not an Indian, but a family. He saw the same fierce, protective love that he had felt for Martha, a love that was now the only living thing inside his hollowed-out chest. He stepped off the porch. The crunch of his boots on the gravel was loud in the sudden, tense silence. "That's far enough," Elias called out, his voice rough from disuse. Shaw turned, his eyes narrowing with a mixture of surprise and contempt. "Well, look what we have here, an old farmer playing hero." He spat a stream of tobacco juice into the dust. "This ain't your concern, old man. We're just collecting a bounty. Go back inside, and you might live to see another sunset." Elias walked forward slowly, his hands held open at his sides. He stopped about 20 feet away, placing himself between the Outlaws and the Comanche family. "They're on my land," he said, his voice leveled despite the tremor of adrenaline that coursed through him. "That makes them my business. You and your men need to get gone." A ripple of cruel amusement went through Shaw's men. Chayton watched Elias, his dark eyes filled with a guarded astonishment. He had expected nothing from the white man but, at best, indifference. He certainly had not expected this. Shaw laughed, a grating, ugly sound. "Your land? This dusty patch of hell? You're defending them over us?" He gestured dismissively at Chayton. "He's nothing, they're nothing. Now get out of the way before I decide to water this sorry excuse for a ranch with your blood." Elias didn't move. He simply shook his head. "No." The single word hung in the air, an act of defiance so absolute it seemed to change the very quality of the light. The time for talk was over. Shaw's hand dropped to his gun, and the world exploded in a cacophony of thunder and fire. Elias was already moving, diving to the side as the first shot tore through the air where he had been standing. He drew his own pistol as he hit the ground, rolling and coming up on one knee. He fired, his aim steady, and one of Shaw's men cried out, clutching his shoulder as he tumbled from his horse. Chayton seized the moment, lunging forward with his knife, a blur of controlled fury. He closed the distance with one of the dismounted outlaws, and the man went down with a choked gasp. But they were still outnumbered. Gun smoke filled the air, acrid and blinding. A bullet screamed past Elias's ear. Another kicked up a spray of dirt by his boot. He saw Shaw taking aim, not at him, but at Winona and the child, who were huddled near the flimsy protection of a mesquite bush. Without a second thought, Elias shoved himself to his feet and lunged into the line of fire. It was not a choice. It was an instinct, a final, desperate act of a man who had nothing left to lose and had just found something worth defending. The first bullet hit him in the side, a searing, white-hot agony that stole his breath. He staggered but stayed upright. The second slammed into his thigh, and his leg buckled beneath him. A third ripped through his shoulder. The fourth caught him high in the chest, a dull, crushing impact that felt like a sledgehammer. He fell to his knees, his vision starting to swim in a sea of red and black. He saw Chayton, having dispatched his opponent, grab a fallen outlaw's pistol and return fire with deadly accuracy. Through the haze of pain, Elias saw Shaw, his face a mask of rage, aiming for the killing shot. Elias tried to raise his pistol, but his arm wouldn't obey. Then, a fifth bullet struck him, a final, fiery punctuation to the violence. The world tilted on its axis, the sounds of the fight fading into a distant roar. His last conscious thought was of the prairie grass, rough and dry against his cheek, and the sudden, profound quiet that followed. When awareness returned, it came in fractured pieces. The first thing he registered was not pain, but gentleness, a cool cloth on his forehead, a soft pressure on his wounds. He forced his eyes open, the sunlight a physical blow. Winona was kneeling beside him, her face etched with a focused intensity. Her hands, stained with his blood and a dark, herbal paste, moved with a sureness that belied the chaos that had just passed. The outlaws were gone. 2 bodies lay still in the dust, but Shaw and the others had fled. He tried to speak, but only a dry, rattling sound came out. Winona placed a finger to her lips and offered him a sip of water from a small skin. It was the most profound kindness he had ever known. Chayton stood over them, a silent, grim guardian. He looked down at Elias, and in his eyes, Elias saw not pity, but a deep, solemn respect that went beyond words, beyond cultures. A debt had been incurred, an alliance had been forged in blood and sacrifice. Chaitan met his gaze, gave a single sharp nod, and then turned. He spoke to Winona in their language, his voice low and urgent. She nodded in reply, her attention never wavering from her patient. Then Chaitan mounted one of the outlaws' abandoned horses and rode away, not back the way he had come, but hard and fast toward the east, as if chasing the sun. Winona stayed. With a strength that seemed impossible for her slender frame, she managed to half-drag, half-carry Elias back to his own porch. She tended to his 5 wounds with an expertise that surpassed any doctor Elias had ever known. She cleaned them, packed them with the strange, pungent herbs, and bound them with strips of cloth torn from her own dress. She gave him water and a bitter, fever-reducing tea, and sat with him through the long, agonizing night as his body fought a war against death. Elias drifted in and out of a delirious haze, the pain a constant, throbbing tide. In his moments of clarity, he would see her, a steadfast silhouette against the lamplight, a guardian angel he had never known he needed. He awoke the next morning to a different world. The fever had lessened its grip, leaving him weak and aching, but lucid. The first thing he noticed was the silence. The ever-present wind had died down, and the air was still. The second thing he noticed was that Winona was no longer alone. He pushed himself up on one elbow, a groan of agony escaping his lips. Winona was at his side instantly, helping him sit up. She gestured toward the yard, her expression unreadable. Elias followed her gaze, and his breath caught in his throat. His ranch was no longer empty. Spread out across the parched fields as far as he could see were people. Scores of them, hundreds. Comanche warriors on horseback, their families beside them, their faces stoic and purposeful. They were not gathered for war. There were no raised weapons, no angry cries. There was only a profound, organized quiet. He saw Chaitan, sitting tall on his horse, speaking to a group of elders. He had returned, and he had brought his nation with him. Elias stared, his mind struggling to comprehend the impossible sight. He thought it was a fever dream, a final hallucination before the end. 200 people, maybe more, stood on his failing land. Then they began to work. Without a single word being exchanged with him, a group of men rode toward the crumbling line of his northern fence, carrying tools and fresh-cut posts. Another group, led by Chaitan himself, began walking the dry creek bed, pointing and gesturing, planning a new path for the water that was not there. Women began to move toward his neglected vegetable garden, their hands already working to clear the dead stalks and turn the hard soil. Children, quiet and watchful, began to gather firewood. It was a silent, perfectly orchestrated invasion of help, a debt of honor being repaid on a scale Elias could never have imagined. He had offered his life for one family. In return, an entire tribe had come to save his. Days bled into weeks. Elias slowly healed, a prisoner on his own porch, bearing witness to a miracle. The constant, rhythmic sound of labor replaced the oppressive silence he had lived with for so long. The sharp ring of hammers on fence posts, the steady scrape of shovels against the earth as a new, deeper irrigation channel was dug from the creek to his fields. The soft murmur of voices as women worked together, weaving baskets and tending to the now thriving garden, which they had seeded with their own precious corn and squash. Winona and her son remained close, bringing him food, not his own meager rations, but rich stew and warm bread. She would change his dressings, her touch always gentle, and sit with him for a while, a comfortable silence stretching between them. Sometimes her son, a boy of about 5, would shyly offer Elias a smooth river stone or a hawk's feather. Elias would accept it with a nod and a faint smile, a language of gratitude that needed no translation. One evening, Chaitan came and sat with him on the porch steps. For a long time, neither of them spoke. They watched as the setting sun painted the sky in hues of orange and purple. The ranch, Elias's ranch, was transformed. The fences were strong and straight. The new ditch held a trickle of water coaxed from deep within the earth. The fields, once barren, were now cleared and ready. "You are a strong man," Chaitan said finally, his English careful and deliberate. Elias looked at his own bandaged body, at the wreck he had become. He shook his head. "No, I'm just a fool who got himself shot." "A man who fights for another man's family is no fool," Chaitan replied, his gaze steady. "He is a brother." He pointed a chin toward the bustling activity in the yard. "My people know this. You fought for one of us, so all of us fight for you. We fight the dust. We fight the dry sky. We make this land live again." Tears welled in Elias's eyes, the first he had shed since Martha died. They were not tears of grief, but of a profound, overwhelming gratitude that filled the hollow spaces inside him. He had faced down death to defend the sacred idea of family, and in return, he had been given one. As his strength returned, he began to walk among them, a strange patriarch of this new, impossible community. He learned their names, or at least tried to. He learned a few words of their language, clumsy on his tongue, but always met with patient smiles. He shared his coffee, and they shared their stories, told in gestures and broken English, and a mutual understanding that ran deeper than words. The loneliness that had been his constant shadow for 3 years had vanished, burned away by the warmth of 200 souls who had made his home their own. They did not ask for payment, they did not ask for ownership, they simply worked, repaying a debt that, in their eyes, could never be fully settled. They were restoring the life he had been willing to give for them. One day, the rains came, a slow, steady downpour that soaked into the thirsty earth, filling the new irrigation ditch and turning the dust to dark, rich mud. Everyone stopped what they were doing and simply stood, faces turned to the sky, letting the cool water wash over them. Elias stood on his porch, leaning against a post, and laughed. It was a real, deep-bellied laugh, a sound he thought had died in him forever. He had been a struggling rancher, a man drowning in solitude and sorrow. He had faced down a band of wild outlaws and taken 5 bullets meant for others. He should have died in the dust of his own failure. But he didn't, because on the next day, and for all the days that followed, 200 Comanches showed up to work on his farm, and in healing his land, they healed his soul. The wind still blew across the Texas plains, but it no longer sounded like a thief. It sounded like a song.